Yeah, so today we're going to have two talks. So mine is about 30 minutes long, and so we'll try to get through that. But feel free to interrupt me in between if you have any questions or comments, because a lot of the stuff I'm going to be presenting is a little bit speculative and just kind of my own thoughts. So I'd love some feedback on that. So as you can see, the title of my talk is Breaking Down the Risks of Life Sciences Research. And so as you might guess from that title, we're going to be looking at two different questions throughout this talk. First is, how can we categorize the different risks that arise from life sciences research? And secondly, after we've done categorizing them, how should we prioritize among these different risks? And so before I go into the meat of the talk, I want to just kind of throw out some disclaimers. Basically, I kind of already said this, but I'm not really an authority on this subject. I just kind of thought about it for a few hours at most. And again, feel free to interrupt if you have any disagreements or agreements. Second, along those same lines, all conclusions presented here are tentative, and I might change my mind upon further reflection. And finally, although this is a talk oriented basically just looking at the risks of life sciences research, of course, all life sciences research is dual use. It can be used for good or bad. And so just keep that in mind, that this is going to be a very skewed talk towards the risk perspective. So I want to start off by presenting kind of the first case study that some of you here may already be aware of how life sciences research can be risky. And this is the H5N1 studies back in 2011. So in 2011, two researchers submitted papers to Science and Nature respectively that detailed research that enhanced the transmissibility of H5N1 avian influenza between ferrets. And this was kind of a big deal at the time because ferrets turn out to be a really good model for transmissibility of viruses among humans. And so at the time, there was the National Science Advisory Board for Biosecurity, or NSABB, which is a federal advisory board that could receive papers and basically evaluate them for their risk and make recommendations as to whether they should be published or not. And so these papers were sent to NSABB for evaluation. And before I'm going to kind of finish off the story later in the talk. But first, I want to, again, just kind of give you a sense of why these papers were such a big deal. So here you can see a chart basically looking at two key factors that we use to evaluate the, I guess, scariness of a virus. So on the y-axis here, we have basic reproduction number, or R0. And this is a measure of transmissibility of viruses. You can see a kind of detailed definition on the top right-hand corner. And then on the x-axis here, we have case fatality rate, which is a measure of lethality or severity of a potential pandemic. So here on the top left corner, we have the 1918 flu, which is, of course, one of the worst public health disasters in human history, with a third of the world infected, and about 50 million people ended up dying from that. And we have a fairly high R0, around 2, but the case fatality rate was fairly low, at least on the scale of this graph, at about 2.5%. On the contrary, H5N1, which, if you recall, is the virus that these two papers that were submitted in 2011 were looking at, had a very, very high case fatality rate, about 60%, at least in the cases at the time, whereas the basic reproduction number, or R0, was fairly low at about 0.7. So it had difficulty. Yes?
Just quick comment. Look it up.
Yeah, sure.
Apparently for random people, the R0 numbers usually around.
Yeah. Yeah, so this was a little bit higher than normal influenza, but it's around that same range. But yeah, avian influenza is unusual in the sense that it doesn't transmit that well between people. And so, of course, the gain-of-function research that was going on at the time with these 2011 papers threatened to kind of bring this H5N1 R0 up above 1, which is kind of the necessary threshold that a virus needs to be able to sustain itself and have pandemic potential. And of course, if the 1918 flu could cause so much damage when it was on this side of the graph, if you have H5N1 over here with a much higher case fatality rate that a lot of people thought could be really a huge disaster. Now, even though I think that basic picture is accurate, I feel like every time numbers like these are presented, it should come with a caveat that these R naught and case fatality rate numbers are not inherent to the viruses themselves. They do interact with how society responds to the virus. So, the same virus, if the 1918 flu came back, the case fatality rate could be higher or it could be lower depending on our countermeasures at the time, for example. It's not like the 1980 flu just has an R naught of 2 and it has a case fatality rate of 2.5%. That's totally determined by how we respond to it. Yes?
So can these only be measured after a pandemic occurs?
Yeah, that's my understanding, is they're basically, measured in hindsight. Yeah. Okay, so I'm using the H5N1 experiments as just a special case, but I think they're a good jumping off point to kind of look at the risk of life sciences research in general. And so if we look at exactly what people were worried about when these H5N1 experiments were going on or were being published, I think there's basically two main categories of risk here. So first are the risks that arise from conduct. So basically, people are worried that if somebody's working in the lab with the H5N1 virus and somehow that virus was released from the lab, that could end up initiating a global pandemic. And then secondly, there's a category of risk from communication. So this is basically if somebody can use the information provided in the publications that result from the research as a blueprint to create a new modified virus. And of course, in the EA community, we typically think of these as info hazards. So I'm going to kind of go through each of these categories in turn, starting from the risk from the conduct of life sciences research, which I've defined here as risk incurred from the production of potentially hazardous materials and information in the course of carrying out life sciences research. So not afterwards, but while the actual research is going on. And here I further subdivide into three different categories. That from accidental release, from insider threat, or somebody who's actually working in the labs releasing a pathogen intentionally, and also from outsider threat. So somebody from the outside community coming in and stealing a pathogen from a lab that's working with it. And again, I'm going to go through each of these in turn. Starting from accidental release, so just to give kind of a few quick examples to give you a picture of what this might look like. For example, a researcher that's working with a modified pathogen might get infected accidentally with a needle stick, or a natural disaster could cause stocks of pathogens to become released if they're not stored properly. Sorry for the really text-heavy slide, but I think a good way about thinking of these risks is, of course, to look at both the probability of accidental release as well as the impact of potential accidental release. So to kind of give you a base feeling of the probability of accidental release, there are a number of historical examples. Notably, I found that smallpox was released from British labs very soon after, in three events very close together, 1966, 72, and 78, which was, it seems like a tragedy that it wasn't able to be contained the second and third times. And potentially in 1977, there's some speculation that there was a strain of H1N1 that escaped a lab as well. Of course, those are over 40 years ago now, and so you might think that things have gotten better, and it looks like potentially they may have, given these numbers that I was able to find by reported by the CDC. So it looks like if you look at their official numbers, there were about 1,000 labs of 1,000 BSL-3 labs, biosafety level 3 labs, operating for each year between 2004 and 2010. And out of all those 1,000 labs for those 7 years, it seems that there's only been 4, at least reported, laboratory-acquired infections from select agents. Of course, these are only looking at select agents, but those are the agents that we're presumably the most worried about. And so if you kind of just take that as a base rate, you end up with about 0.006 lab escapes per lab per year. And if we're now kind of extrapolating that number towards the number of labs that are currently working with live potentially pandemic pathogens, which is about 50 worldwide, and then if we just look at a time frame of over a decade, we can expect about 0.3 lab escapes per decade for, say, for the next decade. Which you might think is high, might think is low. That depends on your perspective. But of course, not every laboratory-acquired infection ends up leading to a pandemic. In fact, these 4 didn't result in any secondary infections at all. So we also have to ask the question, how many of these lab infections would lead to a pandemic? So one analysis that I found predicts that only about 1% of lab-acquired infections specifically from gain-of-function flu research, and this is looking at a virus with a R naught of 2, would seed a global pandemic. And so basically dividing this number further by 100, it's about 0.3% chance per decade of a lab accident seeding a global pandemic, which again, you might think is high, you might think is low, but that's kind of, I think, a good ballpark estimate. I should note that many analyses of these two numbers exist, and there are varying results. I think there's a little bit more consensus on a number like this, although most people have a little bit higher than 0.3 lab escapes per decade that they've estimated. But I think this second number here, the percent of infections that would result in a pandemic, is all over the place. And some of it reflects people's kind of biases. So the lowest estimate I was able to find was 0.0025%. And that was notably reported by Fouchier, who is one of the people on the H5N1. He was the lead author on one of the H5N1 publications. This is kind of going in a back and forth. And I've heard that as publications have, some analyses have led to as high as 60% prediction of this probability. So I would say we really don't have a great idea of where this number falls. And so that's something that potentially could benefit greatly from further analysis. Here I just take this 1%, but really it could be. We really don't know where that true number lies. So that was looking at the probability of accidental release. Now looking at the impact. So I make just a few kind of comments here. First, I would think that the most expected impact would come from gain-of-function studies looking at basically viruses with both high lethality and high transmissibility, like the H5N1 viruses. Some potentially pandemic pathogens, maybe if you're not doing gain-of-function research on them, they have a kind of limit as to how much damage they can cause because you're not kind of extending beyond their natural capabilities. But for gain-of-function research, that's really where maybe most of the expected impact lies, and so that's where our oversight efforts perhaps should be the strongest. So if we look at some back-of-the-envelope numbers, if we ended up having a pandemic with a similar profile as what the 1918 flu pandemic had, which involved infecting about a third of the world with, again, a 2.5% case fatality rate. In terms of today's world population, this would lead to about 62.5 million deaths. If we look at a pandemic that had a similar profile as the 2009 swine flu pandemic, but with a higher case fatality rate. So this is perhaps what a lot of people were fearing the swine flu pandemic would be in the first place. So this would be a quarter of the world infected with, say, as high as 10% case fatality rate. This would lead to 190 million deaths, which is almost twice the number of deaths as all the wars in the 20th century combined. And as you saw with avian influenza, there are reports of 60% case fatality rate, so this is even much lower than that. But again, it remains to be seen if it would actually be 60% based on our response to it. But in any case, this is just kind of the expected fatalities for this profile. So if we do just a really, I guess, naive expected impact kind of calculation, if we take that previous 0.03% chance per year of lab accident seeding a global pandemic, and you take this 190 million death impact, that leads to about 57,000 deaths per year, which is the same ballpark as the opioid crisis in the US currently. And again, all these numbers have high uncertainties around them, so it's I wouldn't take these as all that conclusive, but it's just, I think, a start. So if we next jump to risk from insider threat, this is when people think of insider threat, of course, basically who everybody thinks of is Bruce Ivins, who was the prime suspect for carrying out the 2001 anthrax attacks. And in fact, I think that he is the only historical example, at least the only one that I am aware of, for somebody who actually released a pathogen from a lab intentionally. And so, given that he's the only historical example, it's hard to really draw too many generalizations out of that. But I guess we could try as a start And we could say that if there's only been one known deliberate release from an insider threat out of about 10,000 individuals per year who have access to select agents, and we say that has been the case for about 18 years since 2001, this ends up with a very low number of deliberate releases per worker per year. And if we, again, just concentrate now on the workers that have access to potentially pandemic pathogens, and so now I'm assuming about 20 per lab for the 50 labs worldwide that have access, this would be about 0.06 deliberate releases of potentially pandemic pathogens per decade, which is notably about 5 times fewer expected incidents than accidental releases. And so, obviously, with only one historical example, that one could happen tomorrow, and then this you'd have everything would be doubled. But even if that happened, then you'd still be lower than accidental releases. So I think this is some good reason to expect that accidental releases are a little bit more of a concern, at least probability-wise, than an insider threat. Of course, probability is only one side of the equation, so you have to look at the impact of deliberate release as well. And here's where insider threat might be more threatening than an accidental release, because of course insider threat can kind of control the circumstances of the release, and so there's a small chance that insider threat could perhaps deliberately modify the pathogen even more than what the lab was working with to begin with. Insider threat might also take steps to hide the origin of any sort of a burgeoning pandemic, and so attribution would take a little bit longer. That might slow down the response. There's of course the possibility that the insider threat might decide to have multiple releases of the pathogen in different locations, and given this possibility, public fear would also be greatly enhanced over an accidental release scenario, because the public would basically not know whether another attack was coming, and so this could greatly instill fear in a lot of people, as happened in the 2001 anthrax attacks. So basically the conclusion of this slide is perhaps you would expect the impact of deliberate release to be higher than that of accidental release from insider threat. And then finally, looking at risk from outsider threat. So again, somebody from the outside coming in, breaking into a lab and stealing a potentially pandemic pathogen. If we look at the probabilities, basically, I don't know if there's any historical examples. I don't know if anybody else knows of any historical examples of this, but I couldn't find any. The CDC reports that since the inception of the select agent program, there was no reported thefts of select agents. Yes. On Ebola, I don't know actually. Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, definitely let me know. But based on based on my knowledge, that I thought maybe there's no historical examples. I thought this is perhaps lower probability than accidental release or insider threat. So that's my conclusion as far as probability is concerned. For impact, I think that perhaps you could expect it to have higher impact than accidental release for the same reasons as you might for insider threat. Yes. Okay, gotcha. And also, I would expect this impact to be a little bit less than that of insider threat, given that I'm imagining an outsider threat with less knowledge about how to handle pathogens and how to best transmit them. And so perhaps, and this is, I think, the case with Shinrikyo when they were having problems trying to transmit like anthrax or something, or disperse anthrax widely. They didn't really know exactly how to do that, and so they didn't do, I guess, a great job with that. And so this could lessen the impact. So that's obviously all. Those are all kind of analyses that that take into account what we know right now. So moving into the future, how can we expect these risks to, these probabilities and impacts to potentially change? So I think one interesting thing I found was, well, there's often a lot of talk about how there's a proliferation of BSL-3 and BSL-4 labs in the past few decades, and from what I could find, that potentially could have been true in the early 2000s, potentially right after 2001, but it seems to have leveled out, at least if we're just looking at the entities registered with the select agent program and those with access to select agents over time. It seems to have leveled out. Of course, the last time point that I have here is 2010, so we can't really say necessarily for the next 8 years exactly what has happened, but at least this trend seems to show that proliferation of labs doesn't seem to have continued on to the present. Yes.
Are these just US labs?
Yes, I think these are just, because this is the Select Agent Program, yeah. So these are just US labs. Yeah, it could be different worldwide for sure. Yeah, and the same with the workers. It seems to have leveled out towards these later years here. And so based on that data, I tentatively concluded that the probability of pathogen release from the conduct of life sciences research might be expected to remain relatively constant in the near future, or maybe even decrease as safety and security standards improve, as they have over the past few decades. And of course, that's again probability, but for the impact of pathogen release, maybe that will increase as we become more and more capable of more dangerous research, again, as has been the case over the past few decades. So kind of putting all this all together, I have this little chart here that shows kind of where I rank the different threats in terms of their probability and impact of release based on everything we've talked about, with probability of release, perhaps accidental release is the highest, followed by insider threat, followed by outsider threat. And then in terms of impact, perhaps insider threat is the highest, followed by outsider threat, followed by accidental release. So, you know, obviously these graphs have no axes, there's no scale or anything like that, so it's very subjective, and you could kind of, you could put these dots in many different configurations that still maintain those two kind of inequalities that I mentioned. But I think this is just kind of my subjective placements of these threats currently, and as you go from the bottom left to the top right, you get increasing total risk, taking into account probability and impact. So currently I'm thinking accidental releases might be highest, followed by insider threat, followed by outsider threat. And over time, of course, this is just a current snapshot, but over time you might expect each of these dots to move up and perhaps stay relatively constant along the horizontal axis. So that's, you know, again, very subjective, but that's my current assessment right now. So again, we have two different categories of life sciences research, conduct and communication. So now I'm going to start talking about communication. For communication, I define that as risk incurred from the dissemination of info hazards that has to do with life sciences research to potentially bad actors, which of course just begs the question, who are bad actors? Who are the actors that we're most concerned about? And so here I've written just a number of different actors that we could potentially be concerned about when we're thinking about dissemination of info hazards. So that involves members of the life sciences community, national governments, the DOI bio community, or terrorist groups or individuals. And to kind of get a good sense of which of these actors we should be most concerned about in terms of info hazards, I think it's good to look at basically all the different factors that are involved in terms of what is necessary to actually carry out a bioattack. So I basically just listed kind of all the different categories of all the different factors that I think would be necessary to carry out a bioattack on the numerator. So you need, of course, a motive to do so. You need enough resources to carry out an attack. Tacit knowledge here, which I've defined is basically, you know, knowledge that you have to gain by experience. So these are just basically techniques that you can't really just read a procedure and necessarily follow correctly. Things like, you know, how to actually use a micropipette correctly, such that you're, you know, measuring out the correct quantities. And explicit knowledge, which are basically the step-by-step procedures that you would read off and be able to just follow. You know, this is how you start a pandemic or something. You know, just a method section of a paper or something like that. And then finally, high-level ideas, basically just having the idea in the first place that you could, like, for example, make a more transmissible H5N1 virus and start a pandemic that way. And then finally, in the denominator, there's oversight. So the amount of kind of legal or other oversight that is preventing you from carrying out an attack. And so given all these different factors, I think if we're just looking at info hazards, basically communication of info hazards, I think, increases the magnitude of these two terms specifically. And we can ask basically, to what extent are these two terms the limiting factors to the risk score for each actor? So if all these other scores are high, but if all these other numbers are high and these two numbers are low, then that would be basically the worst case scenario in terms of what we should be worried about for communicating info hazards. So I'm basically going to go through these actors and put in, again, just my best subjective guesses for these different factors. So starting with the life sciences community, I'm not going to kind of explain every different factor here, but you can see that basically motive is the limiting factor in terms of what the life sciences community may be able to carry out. And you might expect that they would already have all the knowledge. I coded explicit knowledge as medium because not everybody in the life sciences community would necessarily know. Not all life sciences is the same, and so not everybody would necessarily have explicit knowledge about how to carry out certain procedures, and so I have that as medium. So with that being the case, I think it would still be a good idea to, of course, limit dissemination of explicit blueprints for pathogen synthesis. And before I go on, I should also note, of course, that all these different communities I'm talking about are not monolithic. So, of course, some members in the life sciences community are going to be different than others, especially for this next session, national governments. National governments are very heterogeneous. This I think, section is probably the least clear given that heterogeneity. But in terms of what I could get as kind of like a rough first pass at it, this is kind of what I'm coding. I have it as fairly similar to the risk of dissemination to the life sciences community. Yes. I don't know if they necessarily have units. Yeah, there's no units. Yeah. So the end number here is supposed to correlate to some sort of probability of being able to carry out a bioattack.
So the probability. I think it's mostly that the probability scales linearly with each of them if you hold the others constant.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, so each one of those is not necessarily probability, but the total probability depends on these factors, I would say. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know if that makes sense like mathematically, but that's just kind of how I was thinking about it. Yeah, go ahead. Oh, okay, thank you. Yeah, so here I have a fairly similar coding to the life sciences community, given that governments will generally be operating through state scientists, and so mostly these are very similar. For the DIY bio community, again, I have motive as one of the limiting factors, but they're also lacking a little bit in explicit knowledge and high-level ideas. So again, it's still important to limit dissemination of info hazards to the DIY bio community. And then finally, for terrorist groups and individuals, of course, where they score the highest is for motive, and among the lowest are explicit knowledge and high-level ideas. So I think this is a community that we should be one of the most concerned about in terms of communicating info hazards. So again, putting this all together, if we look at the percent change in the risk score upon receiving potentially hazardous information, I would say that the life science community and national governments are about similar, and they're at the lowest end of the spectrum, followed by the DIY bio community, and then finally terrorists at the top end. So kind of upshot of this is that if we want to communicate, if we have to communicate potentially hazardous information, we should do so in ways that are more likely to be consumed by the life sciences community and national governments than by the DIY bio community and terrorists. So for example, in academic publications. So I'm going to take a little bit of a detour from looking at risk from communication, because I think there's a few other implications that fall out of this general risk scoring model. So first of all, if you look at the basically high resource availability and knowledge of all forms, so tacit, explicit, and high-level ideas, currently I think the life sciences community and national governments might be the most capable actors of carrying out a bioattack, because the DIY bio community and terrorist groups and individuals currently lack in, for example, tacit knowledge and resources that are necessary. However, this is just one snapshot in time, so over time, we might think that the DIY bio community and terrorists might become increasingly capable, given the the change in terms of what is necessary for the change in the amount of resources that are necessary to carry out a bioattack. So resource availability as a term in that equation becomes less and less important, as well as explicit knowledge as procedures become more and more widely disseminated for carrying out basic synthetic biology kind of procedures. Given those kind of implications, if we think about the life sciences community as kind of synonymous with insider threat on this graph, we can start to put in other actors on this graph based on what we just talked about. So if we put national governments to the right of it a little bit, and the DIY biocommunity terrorists to the left of it, given lower capabilities currently, you can start to kind of fill in different threats on this general graph, and you can start to kind of prioritize your different risks that way. Of course, I didn't put too much thought into where exactly to put these additional actors that I just put in, but I think it's kind of a good way to think about how to prioritize among these different risks. And again, so here you'll see that I have two different colors, so these correspond to different kind of trajectories over time. So going back to the risk from communication, I told you I was going to talk about the aftermath of the H5N1 kind of debacle, and I want to bring it up here to make a point, which you'll see at the end. So the last we left off, the NSABB received these publications for evaluation, and they ended up recommending publication of both papers, but redacting the methods. And so they said that the methods could be provided, but only to those with a legitimate need to know. In February and the following year, the WHO convened a meeting of specifically flu researchers, and they all concluded that redaction is kind of infeasible. There's no way to really know who's in a legitimate need to know position. And at this meeting, basically, it was a consensus in terms of there was a recommendation that full publication of both papers occur. So the NSABB held another meeting that following month, and this coincided with a release of a new government policy for oversight of life sciences research. But they basically changed their tune and said that they recommend full publication of both papers, given new information that had arrived at that time, which was mostly as a result of this WHO meeting. Immediately following that, the NSABB was stripped of its ability to review specific manuscripts, so it can no longer do that. I think people were basically just kind of embarrassed with how the process went during this whole debacle, that there was just kind of this flip-flop back and forth, and people didn't think the process was working so well. And so we no longer have an entity that can review dual-use research. And then in the following months, these two papers were published in Nature and Science. So the reason that I bring this up is that if we're looking at managing the risk from communication, this is, I think, a relatively difficult task compared to managing risk from conduct. Managing risk from conduct, you can imagine all you have to do is implement some safety security procedures that basically everybody can agree that agree which procedures at least work. Maybe not everybody agrees which are necessary, but at least we kind of know how to manage these risks. But in terms of managing risk from communication, you can see that there's a lot of disagreement. So here again, the flu researchers versus the NSABB, there was a lot of clash there. And also, I think something that came out of this entire thing was there's a lot of public attention that was brought upon the H5N1 papers, which if we're thinking about, again, actors in terms different actors that we're worried about and media sources they consume, maybe terrorist groups and individuals are more likely to look in the public media and not likely to look at these academic papers. So basically, after we had all this controversy, that would probably bring that more to their attention than if we didn't have a controversy. And so sometimes you can have backfiring from trying to manage these risks from communication. These are the two categories that I've talked about so far, and this is, I think, my last slide. So it's kind of just last minute. Whoops. Well, there's supposed to be an animation here. So there's supposed to be a third kind of category that comes in, which I call capabilities development. So basically, increasing our capability to do dangerous life sciences research by, obviously research. That's what research does. It increases our capabilities, and so that's another category of how how conducting life sciences research can result in greater risk. So I think these two categories are very focused on specific pieces of research right now. What are the risks from those specific papers or specific experiments that we're conducting? But then the general trend is we're getting greater and we're gaining greater and greater capabilities to conduct dangerous research, and so the risk over time from that is also something to be aware of. Yeah, so that's the end of my talk. I have a bunch of references here for some of the numbers that came earlier. I repeat the disclaimers in case you forgot, but I'm happy to take any questions at this point.